process changes enabled them to be nimble and agile, which they weren't. You'd think they were more so, but they were very bureaucratic. So it enabled them to, as the CEO summed it up well, was to stay ahead of the curve.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with different BPM practitioners. And we dive into all areas of business and what BPM can bring to an organization. And obviously, the different people I'm talking with, they've got their own background, their own experience, and their own, I guess, current situations and scenarios that they're working in. And so I'm really excited to dive into the conversation today with James Anson. Now, James is the co-founder and a consultant at Aequus Consulting, and he is also a board member with the ABPMP, which is the Association of Business Process Management Professionals, the Australian chapter. Very excited for today's conversation. James, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Daniel. I look forward to it.
So what we might do to begin with, James, is obviously that was a very short introduction of who you are and your background. And I think what would be really valuable for our audience to understand is when were you first introduced to the idea or the concept of process-based management, and take us on a journey leading up to what you're doing today.
Yeah, well, I'd have to take you back about 4 decades. Sounds like a long time, doesn't it? To about 1980, where I did a project which was looking at the process yield in dairy factories throughout Victoria. Now, it was a very important industry in Victoria, Australia, and as it is in many countries or many states. This was sponsored by the Victorian government, and we signed up most of the dairy industry in Victoria. It was very groundbreaking, and we didn't really have much in the way of computerization then. So a lot of it was done with manual recorders and paper, tape and so forth. Because what it was looking at was the process efficiency of dairy factories on a big scale, and being able to compare from organisation to organisation. And the thing that struck me, aside from the obvious results, which still stand true today, were visiting the various processing plants and looking at their process. And particularly what fascinated me the most was the interaction between the staff, the workforce, the management, and the process, and how that impacted the overall process efficiency and the way it was managed. So, that varied from American-owned organisations to local private enterprise to a lot of them were cooperatives, dairy cooperatives that were owned effectively by the farmers themselves. And so they came with a different set of, I suppose, objectives in a sense, and different way of managing the process, and also, the staff and the way they viewed them. So some of them, for example, had the supervisors wore different coloured hats to the workforce. It was extremely hierarchical, and others, it was less so. So that was a thread. The reason I mentioned that was a thread that sort of run through my career ever since. The way that I suppose people enable the process, and people also control the process. So controls and enablers are really the cornerstone of process, from my perspective. So that was my first role. Then I worked in the wool industry. So I have a bit of an agricultural background, having grown up on a farm and so forth, but I got into the wool industry, wool testing, developing test methods and machines, robots and so forth. Again, very early days, so we barely had computers, but it sounds like we're going back to the real dark days. But the process controllers had just sort of come out, and you could program those to achieve end results in a robotic sort of way. And so, you know, I did a lot of work on that. That was a different sort of approach. But again, to me, the most important thing was the staff and safety. Because in those days, anything that was robotic was, and today perhaps even to an extent, is not really all that well understood. And what it was doing was replacing some of the really difficult roles that and dangerous roles that the staff had, the workforce had. And so that was always my emphasis. And we always got a lot of cooperative managers to an extent. At that point in time, we got very interested in the quality movement, which again was new, and did a lot of work with the Australian Organisation of Quality Control, it was called. And Toyota was a really big member of that group. It was an industry group, and we used to go once a month for meetings. And the ones I really remember were the guys from Toyota who explained, you know, their approach to continuous improvement and the process methodologies. That introduced me to a different view. And again, we're still back in the early 80s, so 36 years ago. They were going a different sort of approach to process. And we took a lot of that, the work that they'd done, and a lot of the early theory around quality circles and so forth, and introduced those and improved the quality of the process at the, you know, in the wool industry, which was important, extremely important, because the quality of the wool to overseas processors really determines what they will pay for it, and it was, and it still is, you know, a big part of the Australian economy. So that was the next thing. Then I went into consulting and more into the people side of things, and did a lot of work though in what was called in those days re-engineering, with a sort of a tier one global organisation, and what the Americans could do was amazing, and their you know, the theories they had and the practices compared with what we had out here. So I got involved in that, and I ran a small group for that consulting firm in Australia, and we did a few really important landmark projects. And so my view of BPM is not so much the business, the B, but the P, the process. So it's really about, not just about business process, but about all processes that drive the organisation. And so with the big project we did, it really looked at the technical process, so the engineering, the geology. It was a mining organisation, the geology, as well as the management, you know, the financial, the safety, very important, all of those processes. And that really changed the way that organisation operated, you know, from the very top. It transformed it from a bureaucratic, slow, uncompetitive organisation to one which was very fast-paced, networked, and more asset-based. And so they really took a very strong view of the management, not just of the process, but of the assets. Rather than in a bureaucracy, it's really about the management of people and, you know, who gets cars and what job grade you are and all that sort of stuff. So it was a real turnaround, and it transformed that organisation, and it was worth billions of dollars to them, that project. You know, it cost a lot, but it was worth a lot too. Transformed the organisation. So then we did a number of smaller pieces of work which were very similar, but the key thing is the threads that come through. It's not just about the business process, And it's not about the technicalities of things, but it's about the way that you bring the people in the organisation along with you and outside the organisation. But the people understand, and it clarifies the way they work, usually hopefully makes some of the roles simpler. But most importantly, it creates a really good connection between the business, the purpose of the business, and what it's expected to achieve. So they were the real benefits in that early work. But as you know, I sort of got into more projects like that, and always with a view to, you know, looking at the organisation end to end and giving the organisations, the businesses, the tools to manage the processes, not just managing resources, but, you know, ensuring that they take an end to end view of the process. And getting back to my very first project in the dairy industry, being able to establish some very good solid metrics. And obviously it's more complex, you know, than process yields, but it's those sorts of things which, you know, have real meaning to the business and to the organisation. So now I'm sort of involved in this ABPMPA, which is a mouthful. But, you know, again, internationally, that's part of the international group. Some of the things the international group are doing are amazing. We just need to publicise it more and get people more engaged, and particularly more senior people in organisations, because that's where you really need to get the drive, I believe, the drive from. And all those projects that have been most successful right across my career, we've always started with the people who actually manage or run the businesses, because they're the ones who really make the key decisions about those sorts of changes. So that's a little bit of a history about myself.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you're talking there about, I guess, talking to these more senior people within these organizations. They're the ones, I'm assuming, are working closely with the strategy, the overall direction of the organization. So, and I can see that that's been key in a number of conversations that I've had in this series. That's always been a key part of an organization adopting BPM is, do you have the key decision makers on board? Can they see the value, and what questions are they going to be asking, and what are the key metrics that they're going to want to be seeing? Because if you're not articulating or using language that they understand or that they care about, they're not going to want a bar of it.
That's true. Or perhaps worse still, I don't want to be negative, but they could go along with it to a point and waste time, everyone's time, whilst not really believing in it. So I always remember, you know, in my first project, we would plan ahead what we were going to do when we got on site in these dairy factories. And the first thing we did when we got to them, most of them were remote, relatively speaking, was to go to the managers, the process or the manufacturing manager's office, the plant manager's office. And we'd meet the plant manager, who would usually be sitting behind the desk, and we'd start to talk about how we were going to run the project. And they would immediately come back with a completely different set of assumptions than what we had. So the whole project would sort of flip, or pivot is the new word for it, pivot, in a different direction. And whilst we still wanted to achieve the same aims, the way we went about it was different. So that was a learning point for me. You have to go and talk to people who actually can make those decisions. Now, it may not be the most senior people in the business, but it has to be people who actually do have some authority to make things happen. That role, and in the second one, was working very closely with the workforce and the operations people, because you need to have their support as well, especially in big organisations, and that takes you know, an enormous amount of work, both, you know, behind the scenes and also face to face with people, because they need to know they can trust people who they are hiring, if you like, or managing, acquiring in some way, shape or form, to run the projects for them. I think that's very important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's where, BPM may have been misused or misrepresented in the past, if it was brought into an organization to document all of their processes, but there wasn't any big what are we going to do next? What are we going to do with this documentation? How are we going to manage this or improve this? And I think that a big missing link there is working with the workforce, getting the people on board that are actually carrying out the tasks day to day, because they're the ones that are probably experiencing the problems and the hurdles and the difficulties. They're probably the ones that have some of the best ideas around how the process could be improved. So if they're not bored on the journey, then tough luck trying to get them to adopt the improvements or the changes that might take place.
That's right. That's exactly right. And it does affect their role. And anything that's, change related, most people don't. People like certainty. And as soon as they see some bunch of consultants coming in, or BPM people, they get very nervous, because usually it's bad news for them. In some way, shape or form, or that's what they imagine. So, I think just to pick up on a couple of things in the early 90s, I'm only going back 3 decades this time, but in the early 90s, where BPM was called, or when BPM was called re-engineering, process re-engineering, it got a very bad name because what that meant was downsizing.
Right.
Re-engineering, to me, I actually quite like the name, but it became synonymous, particularly in the US, with downsizing and cost cutting. And, perhaps that was necessary, or probably was in those days, and probably still is today in certain instances. But really the idea of the process, business process management or change, is really about making things more effective, as much as making them more efficient. So I think that's one point that's really worth picking up on. And the other point that you mentioned, which is really worth emphasizing, is the impact, the very real impact that these changes have on people's role if they're done well. In some cases, and in my last projects, one of the other consultants that had done a project there before said, "Look, James, come and have a look at this." And so he took me down the wall, and they'd printed out the new process. What in this case, it was a business process, which shouldn't be a very complex one. But anyway, it was printed out on a continuous roll of 1 metre wide paper, and on an HP printer or something. And it was so complex, I don't even know where to start. And it went for about, probably, it seemed like 5 metres, but it was probably about 3 or 4 metres long, maybe 4 or 5 metres long even, metre wide. And it was just like, it was the process, and no doubt about it, that was probably the best, the ideal new process. But to expect people to follow it, to have it up on the wall was almost like a parody of itself.
Right.
Like, this is what not to do. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
However, because what you're saying is right, that it's the individuals. If you can get them to change the way they do things, yes, it's important to have stuff written down and to have charts and so forth, but people really can only remember 3 to 5 things at a time.
Right.
And they like to know that, that the management, and this is not always true, or the staff have their interests at heart. They don't always. of course.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned earlier that, you know, through your consulting work, you've been involved in a number of large transformations of organizations, I'd imagine, where, you know, a BPM was adopted and it was adopted effectively. The right ingredients were put in place to make sure that it was a success. What do you see? What do you see being the difference between an organization that adopts BPM and it goes well and it goes to plan, and then an organization that maybe tries to dip their toe in the water, so to speak, or embark on a BPM initiative, but they don't end up getting the results they were hoping for or looking for?
Yeah. No, I'll give you three things. The three things I think are most important. The first one is you actually do need a burning platform. It sounds like a cliche, but you need to have an external driving force. And in the ones where they've been most successful are those where they've had a real burning platform. And then you need to have the senior leadership who are able to articulate what that is and why it's important, and you know, what are we going to do about it. So they're the two things. The third thing is that you need to then make the way that you're addressing the transformation relevant. So it has to be, you know, very simple and obvious in the linkage is between that burning platform, what they're saying they're going to do and how they're going to address it, and what the individuals, how's it going to change the lives and make you know, the work better, more efficient, more effective, whatever, of the staff or the workforce. And even still, you get a lot of negativity and things can go, you know, pear-shaped at any stage. But I think if you have those three things, you've got a good chance of success.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm assuming that you've obviously, like, as you mentioned, you've seen large organizations completely transformed. Do you have an example of an organization that has adopted BPM, and whether it's say it was an incremental improvement, or whether it was a radical transformation or innovation? But do you have an example where an organization has adopted BPM and they've reaped significant value for the organization? I'm sure there are a lot of different stories, but I think that's one thing that executives or senior leadership, that's what they want to know is, well, what is the potential return on investment, and how long is it going to take to happen? And I think one of the best ways to communicate that is to give examples of, well, this organization experienced this, or we implemented this at this organization, and this was the outcome, this was the result. So do you have an example or a couple of examples of?
Yeah, I have quite a few examples, but I could talk perhaps in just in generalities for a minute, and that is my belief is that unless the benefits are quantifiable in the terms of sort of a 10% of the organisational value, or whether that be measured by the revenue or the profits or whatever they sort of use, but if it's less than that, then it's not really going to make a big enough difference. So if you've got, in one example, let me think, it was about a 10 to $15 billion organisation, and the difference that was made was around about $1 billion to $2 billion in value was generated from that project. Now that was a big project, and it was far-reaching, and it was more than the value that generated in monetary terms. I'm just saying that, you know, as a scale factor of scale. But really what that enabled the organisation was, as the CEO put it, to stay ahead of the curve, to become, for a relatively small organisation in their industry, it enabled them to be a niche player and to beat the bigger players, organisations globally, in certain niches, and not to go sort of chasing things which just weren't going to really yield anything. So basically, not to sort of take on the bigger players at their own game, but the process changes enabled them to be nimble and agile, which they weren't. You'd think they were more so, but they were very bureaucratic. So it enabled them to, as the CEO really well summed it up well, was to stay ahead of the curve, and basically to keep the business just more than viable, but to be a market leader. And it had been in a lot of trouble for various reasons up till that point in time. And today, those changes, 20 years later, you know, are still very important to it as an organisation. So that's one. Another one was an organisation which really had its licence to operate threatened through, you know, just I suppose a lack of attention to details and, you know, a bit of poor management. But they're in an industry where they needed to be audited, and their licence to operate, if I sort of use inverted commas, but was really threatened, you know, severely. So, you know, that was their burning platform. And essentially what we did in monetary terms, it became less important, because if they didn't have a license to operate, they didn't have a business, full stop. So that was really key to that as a metric. And the staff, the senior staff and the management, by taking a process view, you know, by managing process, again, rather than just managing the resources in particular silos, but by managing the process and taking a look at identifying the key processes, like the really big processes that ran across the organisation, they were able to turn it around so that not only was their, you know, license to operate no longer threatened, but, you know, they could audit and they could show, you know, the benefits and the results to the, you know, the powers that be, the industry regulators, that they needed to. So, you know, that made them notice it. You could almost see like a weight lifted off their shoulders. But that was just basically taking a process view of an organisation which should always have had that, but didn't. And that's the same with most organisations, or many. Another one which was very similar, again, technology often creates a burning platform, or technology change for organisations. So in this case, Japanese manufacturers had innovated a new process which almost made this Australian business redundant. You know, that wasn't in a good place to be. And a lot of other technical changes as well made it very difficult for that organisation. And they brought out a very astute American general manager, CEO, you know, who had a law degree from Harvard and everything. And he immediately sort of saw the problems, and he was really alone at first in recognising it. The management in the organisation was sort of turned a blind eye to it all, and thought that it would go away, and were just really hoping that they would keep their jobs without actually doing anything to ensure that the business was viable in the face of some really serious technology challenges. So what we did then was, this was very interesting because it showed very clearly the relationship between culture and process. And so when we did all the analysis, it was really clear that there were two kind of almost separate organisations. They had a different type of process basis, and in fact they had they really required a different culture that's within not a huge organisation, but, you know, sizable, And in fact, what we recommended was, which they adopted, and there was a lot of change, a huge amount of change, as you could imagine. But this concept of the structure of the organisation, the organisational structure, the culture, and the process being the three sort of key legs on the stool or the tripod, were really key. And the American CEO really loved that concept. He thought that was really so innovative that once he saw it, anything less was not acceptable. And so everybody really, I mean, a lot of people lost, those managers who wanted to keep their jobs, unfortunately, just really couldn't cut it in the future of the organisation. But the staff and the workforce readily adapted to it. And because it was just such a natural concept, but nobody really had ever thought of it before. They all just managed their own silos. And, you know, you had marketing that looked after marketing for the whole organisation, and the niche markets of the different areas were different. And what this technology change sort of brought externally brought about a real need to change the way that they addressed, if I could use that word, but addressed the market, the external market. And so that was extremely innovative, and that transformed that organisation.
Yes.
I would say that was probably about 20%, at least 20% difference in the overall, you know, in terms of the overall profitability of the business. So I think it was about $500 million. So it made a difference of about, $100 to $150 million per annum.
Right.
As well as making it viable. So that's what I'm talking about.
And typically, would you say the motivation for an organisation to go through such a transformation, is it generally because of regulation? Is it more so because of innovation? Is it cost cutting? Is it looking for new opportunities for revenue? What motivates an organisation?
Well, I think it's all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a bit glib, but there are different reasons for it, and I think all of those come into play depending on you know, the situation. Obviously, regulation is in a lot of industries is necessary, and you see the financial services industry, for example, in Australia, has been through the Royal Commission, and you know, regulation of the industry was found to be wanting. So that, you know, they paid a huge price for that, and they've had to you know, make a lot of changes, and they still are. Whether that, I don't doubt that they'd really see them as business process management changes, to be honest. But there's been a lot of management change, I suppose you could say. They're probably more, from what I know and understand, more related to the new financial, which is the other thing you're talking about, is the innovation in the industry. I think that, you know, is that's something that's very important there. And the same cost cutting, you know, they're cutting costs to be competitive. But I don't think you can take, you know, I'm not a manager per se, but I think if you just take a cost cutting approach to things, you can end up not really achieving very much. I mean, cost cutting is important, but it's not the overall goal.
No.
Most organisations, you know, have a real purpose, and they define that. These days, they define that, and the goal, and so forth. And usually, the purpose is not to be the cheapest, least expensive organisation. It's really about providing something of real benefit to industry or to communities or customers, globally, locally, domestically. So I think, yeah, to me, it's more about innovation, and being able to compete for the future.
And I guess for some people, that's a little bit difficult to categorize that as a burning platform, so to speak. That like I guess it's easier for some people to look at expenses like budgets blowing out and pain points and things that are happening than creating a new future, creating the new norm, creating a new way of doing business. And I guess over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a lot of startup companies that they'll take on an entire industry. They'll look at, well, how has this industry traditionally operated, and is there a better way? And because they're starting very small and they're a lot more nimble, and they can create a new process, a new way of delivering that value, whether it's, transporting people like we've seen with Uber, or accommodation like we've seen with Airbnb. We've seen some startup companies come and really disrupt things, and it keeps the big organizations on their toes to be like, well, we need to keep creating this future. We need to keep planning for that, because if we sit back on our haunches, so to speak, we're at risk to being disrupted.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, well, that's right. I'll give you a good example that's just happened the last couple of days, and that is Robinhood, which is the app for trading used by day traders. It's like a zero commission type thing, which in combination with blogs and so forth, this has really disrupted the industry big time, the industry being Wall Street, and you've probably heard about it, but they really got stuck into some of these stocks that the big hedge funds had shorted, and through not ramping the stock prices of those that had been shorted, but getting people, day traders, I suppose, little traders, little players in the industry, investing in those stocks, like Game Shop in the US, that had been severely shorted. And normally, though, that when that happens, the businesses just collapse, and the hedge funds walk away with billions of dollars from buying the stock back at 1 cent or something. It completely disrupted that whole process. And so now I think, the regulator's going to have to have a look at that in the US and globally, because a lot of big wealthy players in those hedge funds have been severely disrupted, so to speak. That's an example. That's a really good example.
That's great. Yeah, I haven't heard too much about it. Like, I've obviously seen the headlines, but I haven't been able to dive into it too much so far.
Well,
So being part of ABPMP, I'd imagine that you're obviously well networked with industry leading professionals, people that have been in the BPM space for many decades, and also in your consulting role, you would have worked with a number of Australia's largest organisations and helping them move into the future. What does the future of BPM look like for an organization? And I guess it is a tricky question, because every organization has a different starting point. There are some organizations out there, large organizations, that haven't understood their processes. They've got nothing in place to manage those processes or improve them. And then you've got other organizations that have done that a long time ago, and they're looking at ways that they can, like robotic process automation and process mining, to rapidly discover processes. But I guess moving forward over the next 2, 3, 5 years, where do you think organizations need to be investing their time when it comes to BPM?
Well, I think it's the same as it's always been, really, that you need to look at how you're going to compete in the future and organise around that. So I agree with you that robotic process automation, or RPA, and process mining are really innovative, but they're a means to an end. So it's very easy to sort of get too hung up on particular technologies and so forth, and lose sight of what you're really trying to achieve. So I think that, and I think the process, that's very important. I think where the process management community or profession can have a big impact is being able to develop, let's say, the discipline and market the benefits of the discipline that gives you the means to utilize those new technology, that you mentioned, the new technology. But first and foremost, to help organizations and the people that work in them, work for them, supply them, etc., or are their customers or their investors in them, to really address their longer term interests, and to be able to, for example, to be more competitive, more innovative, more agile. Those tools that you mentioned are a way of doing that. But I think the competitive landscape of industry, of many industries, in the next 5 to 10 years is going to, and everybody knows this, is going to change significantly. It's going to be driven by technology. It's going to be driven by this, hopefully not COVID, which it is at the moment, but it's a very different scenario for the next decade.
So having that clarity around, well, where is the organization heading? Where do we want to be in 10 years? And then what out there can support us or help us?
Yeah, that's right. 10 years is not a very long time. It's a very short time, and it takes a lot of time to really achieve transformation. And like you mentioned before, if you are sort of really only concerned with the here and now, and your next year's budget and your next year's performance review, then things can really change from under your feet, basically, or right in front of your nose, and then you struggle to get back into the game.
Definitely. And for those that are listening,
kids are changing. I sort of see my kids, my younger kids, they grow up and they have all these things. There's more computing power in my watch than we had in a whole building at Monash when I was there.
Yes.
That's the sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And for people that are listening to this episode right now and they're gleaning a lot from our conversation, maybe it's the first time they're being introduced to BPM, or maybe they've been part of many organizations that have tried to implement BPM, but they haven't had, maybe they haven't had the right ingredients in place. They haven't had the right culture there or executive sponsorship. But for that person that wants to learn more about this topic, where would you encourage them to now go? Because, we've been talking for a little over 40 minutes now, and maybe they've got an appetite to learn more, but sometimes the internet can be quite overwhelming with all of the different opinions out there. So.
Yeah, I agree. It can be very confusing. Well, now, this is what I would do, which is what I do personally. So I'm not just saying it, I actually do it. But I would join or become part of a body like the ABPMP. I'm not just saying because I'm involved in it, but I think from people like yourselves and others, and certainly people who know a lot more about it than me, you can learn a lot from them just by, talking to them and listening to them. And the people who are on this, they just give their time endlessly. So, you know, that's a great way for very minimal outlay, and for students, it's like $60 or something a year. So it's fantastic. So that's one. The other thing is the universities are a good place, and I know it's a commitment to sort of sign up for a grad cert or a degree or something, master's. But you could think about that. But I also follow the major universities like MIT, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, those sort of organisations, Melbourne University, U of Q, those sort of organisations. They all have these Twitter things now, Twitter handles. You can follow them. They give you a whole lot of information for free. You just have to have your Twitter on, and it comes in, you know, you can read it while you're falling asleep if you want. But that's fantastic. What they do, those programs are amazing. And you can actually do courses relatively inexpensively online now with those major universities. So you can get a degree from the London School of Economics online now.
Right.
Which is amazing to think of. So those sort of things. But MIT is brilliant. You know, it's just unthinkable as an organisation to us down here. But so that would be two things. But I think, you know, if you can get a start somehow, working on a project or working with other more senior people, and then try and absorb as much as you can. But you're right, things do often go down, you know, endless burrows and never come out. So it's easy to be disheartened. But I would say to, you know, those sort of three things, the more senior people, particularly the associations. Now, ABPMP is one, but there are other ones. There's LinkedIn. You can sort of follow groups on that. You know, we've got a LinkedIn group on which you can follow. You can go to webinars. They have. You've been to some of them, which are free. You have fantastic people like Process Mining and RPA, and you know, careers. We've got one coming up, careers in business process. So that's a wealth of information that's practically free. So is the online stuff. And then, if you know, it is important to have certification, degrees, those sort of things, which, you know, you can do online, or you can go to your local university. That's my. They would be my top 3 or 4 things to do.
That's great. That's really good. And I particularly like what you were saying about ABPMP. I think, you know, being able to glean from those practitioners that are further down the path than you, further down the journey than you. You can ask them questions. You can bring different scenarios, situations to them to ask them, how would you handle this? How would you manage this? How would you go about doing this? And then also what you were saying about being part of a project. For those that are listening right now, if you're in an organization where there are projects happening, if you can, if you're able to get on a project and get that firsthand experience internally, then I think that's very powerful and will be very valuable for your own learning. But James, obviously we've only been able to scrape the surface on a number of different topics within, I think it's been 40, 50 minutes that we've been talking for now. But I just want to thank you for sitting down with me and for sharing your, you know, your experience and a number of different pieces of advice there. I think it's going to really help our audience. For those that are listening, I hope you've been taking notes. I know that you will have gleaned a lot from this episode. But James, thanks for giving us your time today.
Thank you, Daniel. Been most enjoyable.